history of the Middle East that I can remember, there has been more problem of sectarianism spinning out of control. Not even in the 10 centuries ago. And we thought this was an excellent topic, and we assembled an excellent panel to tackle it. The panel will be moderated by Dr. Edmund Gharib, who is on our Palestine Center Committee for many, many years. He is professor at American University and George Washington University School of International Affairs, and without any question, an expert on the Middle East. Again, for those who have just joined us, the moderator will pose questions for the panel to respond to, and probably after an hour, we have an hour and a half panel. After an hour, we will open it for questions and answers to the audience. I'm going to turn it to Dr. Edmund to take it from here.
Thank you, Dr. Ali. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. And we have, as Dr. Ali mentioned, an excellent group of speakers who are extremely knowledgeable about the issues that we are going to be talking about today. They have been working, many of them have been working, actually all of them have been working on this topic and other related topics in the region for a long time. I will basically, as Dr. Ali mentioned, the Middle East has in recent years witnessed some of the most violent sectarian, ethnic, and tribal conflicts in recent memory, whether it's in Iraq after the US invasion, or Syria today, to Lebanon and Egypt. Lebanon, in fact, we shouldn't forget, and maybe this is something that we'll be talking about later. Lebanon probably witnessed one of the most violent conflicts in recent history, sectarian as well. It had other dimensions as well, but Lebanon lost something like 144,000 people who were killed, something like close to 200,000 people who died, and 17,000 people who went missing or disappeared. And if you take these figures for a small country like Lebanon of about 3.5 to 4 million people, you can see the devastating impact that that conflict had. Well, we have clearly what we are seeing now is that sectarianism and sectarian narratives are coloring politics in very, very significant ways. Yesterday, for example, there was a report about Daesh, or the Islamic State of Iraq and Bilad al-Sham, or Syria. They executed a person who they believed was an Iraqi Shiite fighting on behalf of the regime. They cut off his head and they took pictures with him. However, it later became known that this guy was actually a member of another opposition group. And it shows that to a certain extent, the extreme violence and hatred, perhaps, that we are seeing in this conflict. We're seeing bombings of churches, of mosques. We're seeing the killing of people based on their sectarian identity. And this is happening in Syria and in Iraq. Iraq also witnessed huge losses as a result of the war that took place in 2003. I'm not going to go back to the 1990-91 war, but about close to 1 million people died. There are about 2.5 internal refugees, displaced people, and 2.5 million, and 2 million to 2.5 million who are external refugees in neighboring countries and other places in the world. So today, in fact, what we are seeing is that the numbers of people dying in Iraq, and I'm sure this is something that will come up later, is close to the highest period of violence that Iraq witnessed around 2006, 2007. Something like 12,000 people have already been killed in Iraq. In addition to these conflicts, to these very violent and terrifying events that we are witnessing these days, there's another danger, and this is the danger of the fragmentation of the nation states, of the states that had emerged in the post-World War I period. I was being interviewed yesterday on a program to talk about Iran and negotiations and about the Israeli policy. But in the middle of that and of the interview, the correspondent asked a question about Syria. Is Syria going to survive as a country? Have we reached the point where the country is going to fragment? Are we seeing a new Sykes-Picot? By the way, this is it, and this is not the first time I heard this. I've heard it from a number of people in the region. People are now worried that as a result, the countries which were established after Sykes-Picot are now going to be further divided. In Arabic, they say تقسيم المقسم وتجزيء المجزأ. And in fact, this is one of the real concerns that many people have. Whether that or not is going to happen or not, that's not what I'm talking about. But I'm talking about the high level of violence. We're talking about the militarization of the opposition, and of course the regime has used extremely repressive tactics as well. So it's not just one side that has been involved. But one of the other things that I think we are going to be discussing is, again, this phenomena of sectarianism, of ethnicism, or ethnic conflict that we are witnessing in the region. And we have, as I said, an excellent panel, and I will just briefly introduce them to us. I will start with Dr. Yvonne Haddad, who is a professor of the history of Islam and Christian-Muslim relations at the Center for Christian-Muslim Understanding at Georgetown. Professor Haddad has done a great deal of work on the area of Christian-Muslim relations, on the history, modern history of Islam, on the intellectual, social, and political history in the Arab world, and on Islam in North America and the West. She is currently doing research on Muslims in the West and on Islamic revolutionary movement, and she teaches courses on Muslim-Christian relations and Arab intellectuals. Randa Slim, who's to my right, works, of course, she is a scholar at the Middle East Institute and fellow at the National Security Study Program of the New America Foundation. She has published a number of works on international issues related to the Middle East, as well as on issues dealing with democratization in the Arab world. She is a former vice president of the International Institute for Sustained Dialogue. She also has been a senior program advisor at the Rockefeller Fund and a guest scholar at the U.S. Institute of Peace and a program officer at the Kettering Foundation. And she has consulted for a number of U.S. and international organization on foreign affairs issues. The next speaker I will introduce is Dr. David Khairallah, who's next to Randa. David Khairallah has written and spoken extensively on the issue of sectarianism, on recent developments in the political world of the Middle East. He has taught law, international law, and other courses on law at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. and as well as at the Law Center of Georgetown University. He is currently a counsel at the firm of White and Case, and Professor Khairallah was Deputy General Counsel for 5 years at the World Bank, and he was also Deputy General Counsel at the International Finance Corporation Legal Department, which is an affiliate of the World Bank. He also appears quite often on Arab and international television and radio channels. Our next final speaker, or at least in the introductions, is Dr. Ussama Makdisi, who is a professor of history and Arab American Educational Foundation Chair of Arab Studies at Rice University. I think he's the first holder of this chair. He is the author of Faith Misplaced, The Broken Promise of U.S.-Arab Relations, 1820 to 2001, which was published by Public Affairs in 2010, and Artillery of Heaven, American Missionaries and Failed Conversion of the Middle East, which was published by Cornell, and The Culture of Sectarianism, which fits very well with our topic today, Community History and the Violence in 19th Century Ottoman Lebanon, which was published by the University of California Press. And he has published widely in a number of scholarly journals. Well, let me begin to turn to some of to our audience and raise some questions about our topic. And by the way, as Dr. Ali explained to you, we'll try to make it as a conversational and easygoing to a certain extent. But one of the first questions that I would like to ask is, what is the real nature of ethnic and sectarian conflicts in the Middle East? What are the causes behind the rise of sectarianism at this time? And who would like to start? We can go either. Anybody would like to start?
I don't mind.
Okay, David, why don't you take it?
Daoud. Well, usually sectarianism is associated with internal conflicts between communities of different groups, different sects, and it's associated with violence and discord in societies and things like this. For our purposes, I think I would like to define it this way. This definition is the conclusion of observation of all my life. I grew up in a country with a political system that breeds sectarianism, that's Lebanon. And having observed what is going on and what has been going on in the Arab world, and how the sectarian culture has taken roots and is in the forefront of whatever struggle now in the Arab world, I think I can define it this way. It is the promotion and exploitation of religious and denominational affiliation with whatever religion for the purposes of achieving political objectives. So the promoting and exploiting this relationship for political objectives. If we look at the way sectarianism has acted everywhere from the internal level to the more general level, if we look at the nature of what sectarianism, this kind of conflict, what did it do, how could it be exploited? One of its characteristics is that it leads to some kind of tearing apart society. So any party that has an interest in tearing apart a society would try to promote sectarianism. And the way or the reason it has been around for a long time, I mean, belonging to a certain sect on its own does not create violence and did not. But when it is exploited, when it is promoted and guided to do that, it will. If we try to identify certain factors in recent time that have contributed to the culture of sectarianism, if we start from the outside, we look, for example, at the US experience in Afghanistan. When the US went again to Afghanistan after September 11, they found pamphlets that were printed, published by the USAID, quoting verses from the Quran, inciting Afghanis to jihad. So this shows us that it has made a contribution. In Iraq, the U.S. has tried or supervised the sectarianism, institutionalizing sectarianism in Iraq, the constitution, and we see the division, and we see the democracy and what the Iraqi American democracy had brought in terms of peace and harmony in society. And we look also at the inclination of the US now in supporting political Islam. And how did this work in Egypt? We see how it is torn apart. In Syria, we know what's going on now. All over practically. If we take another example, Israel has every interest in seeing any Arab unity dismantled, any strength, any cohesion done away with. And Israel has done a lot. Take, for example, the civil war in Lebanon. It has supported one side against the other. It has interfered militarily in every other way. And not only that, even until today, Israel has fought a war against Hezbollah in 2006 and didn't achieve what it wanted to achieve, that is disarm Hezbollah. But it achieved very well the ability of having a sect, or those who associate themselves with Sunnah Islam in Lebanon, Hariri and what they call 14 Adar, or the 14th of March, adopting what is an Israeli dream, disarming Hezbollah and depriving Lebanon of the ability of defending itself. If we look at the other factor, if we look at Iran, the Islamic Revolution in Iran has brought to the picture this Shia identification that is well spread now in Lebanon. It is another very important factor in the promotion of sectarianism. But the great prize, in my opinion, goes to some countries of the Gulf, Saudi Arabia and others. If we, especially at the present time, if we look at the way things are working in Syria, and they work in Bahrain and other places, we see that certain countries use what I will call corruption, and corruption has been used in the most despicable way in this case. Corruption, the corrupting agent sees a need in the corruptible and try to meet this need. This need could be material, the money or otherwise. This is one thing, or weapons or whatever. And it could be spiritual. And in this case, and this is what makes it despicable, having clergy or ulama, whatever, providing a authoritative fatwa that would incite people, will find them a shorter way to heaven if they go kill and die in a different country. And this is happening now. And the worst kind of corruption, all kinds of human needs have been exploited in this respect. Take, for example, in certain parts of Syria, they have invented the nikah al-jihad, they justified religiously that young women could go and have temporary marriage, 1 hour or two, with those who are holding guns because they need this kind of outlet. So in every way, corruption has been used to create a havoc and capitalize on this sectarian affiliation. Give it some authoritative sources, those who can interpret reliably the will of God on earth, go to a certain believer and tell him the way to go to heaven is to do A, B, C, and D. Go kill yourself and kill someone else and so on. I don't know whether you enough.
Great.
Okay.
Let's, by the way, if anybody wants to comment on any other speaker, please go ahead. Or if you want to go and answer the same question, what are the real causes behind the rise of sectarianism? Maybe Ussama might go into at least the historical factors, or Dr. Haddad, because you've written a book at least on the historical
yeah, I mean,
background.
okay, so what I would say about sectarianism, I think the most important thing to say about sectarianism is that there's no such thing as sectarianism with a capital S. I mean, each country, each location has its own, I mean, this is what historians, of course, believe. Each country has a specific historical, political, social, economic context within which what we describe as sectarianism is occurring or manifesting today. So that's the first point. The second point is to say, insofar as we talk about sectarianism, it's a function of diversity. The fact of the matter is that the Middle East is a religiously pluralistic place, has been, and just like any other society, some of the cleavages are economic, some are political, some are sectarian, religious, communal, and that is an inescapable part of the social, political, economic, religious fabric of society. But I think if we're going to talk about sectarianism today, then we're talking about specific political, historical, economic conflicts. So you mentioned Saudi Arabia. I think the other thing to bear in mind is that when we talk about sectarianism today, we're not talking about religious medieval violence, despite the fact that there are protagonists in the Middle East who invoke Sunni-Shia divides that go back centuries, and despite the fact that Reuters and the BBC and the Guardian and many other Western newspapers almost always preface an article about a sectarian bombing or an incident by talking about the original schism between Sunnis and Shias, although they never mention that when they talk about Ireland, for instance. They don't say that in Ireland there's a conflict because it goes back to the Reformation or Counter-Reformation. I think it's important to bear in mind that the sectarian problems we're dealing with today are a function of the nation-state form. In other words, we're talking about a history that you mentioned, Sykes-Picot, that really begins in the late 19th century and continues until today. And the very term sectarianism in Arabic, at-Ta'ifiyya, is in fact, as far as I can tell, is a word that has come into usage only in modern contemporary Arabic to refer to the opposite of a secular ideal or a national ideal, which is also very modern as well. So these are modern conflicts about resource allocation, about citizenship rights, about state policies and discrimination, about Western intervention, of course, about the map that the Western countries, the British and the French drew, and about how different groups inside different Arab countries react and manipulate these struggles. So in other words, I think we should be very specific about which country we're talking about. Otherwise, it just gets into this massive general discussion about sectarianism with a capital S, which does not exist. There's no one sectarian problem across the region. That's really...
Yeah, I also want to say that, building on what Ussama has said, there's not only, Sunni-Shia schism, and that's how we have come to look at sectarianism. But if you look at Egypt, there is Sunni-Sunni schism. If you look at Iraq, the schism between Muqtada al-Sadr and between the Dawah people. So what I'm afraid of, and I think we in the West, as well as the media, have helped with this, is that the sectarian narrative has really shifted the attention away from the democratic. Yeah, the sectarian narrative. Oh, I haven't tuned Turn it on. Okay. Here, voila.
Turn them on.
The sectarian narrative has shifted the focus away from the democratization narrative. When the Arab Spring started, we were talking about the hopes for democracy. We were talking, and now what we are talking about is more and more Sunni killing Shia. Doesn't mean that it's not happening, but I agree with Ussama that it is very much also a reaction to the upheaval that the region is going through. If we look at group dynamics, at social psychology, this kind of intra-group division within Islam is, as he said, is happened throughout history within Christianity, within other religions, and usually they happen at times of social stress, at times of social upheaval. It is a natural inclination of human beings to revert to a primary affiliation group, to a primary identity group as a source of security. But also in this case, it is a reality that you have states, you have governments, you have political parties that are using sectarian agenda. They are manipulating these sectarian identities to keep this whole focus on democratization and away from their countries, and to keep the whole issue of change and political change away from their countries.
I think one of the things that we're missing is the fact of the fall of the Soviet Union. So we're no more talking about ideologies between West and communism. And so we're beginning to be divided, especially in the Arab world. And it has hit them very strongly because there were several authors who wrote that America is now potentially going to fight Islam. Islam is the ideology. And I think that there are people who are building this up, and it fragmented the area, especially because Saudi Arabia is being pitted against Iran. And I think that as long as the scare of communism was there, there was more holding together because the enemy was identified as something outside, and now the enemy is inside. It has shifted.
Thank you. One of the things that I think we need to touch.
I think you've turned it on.
One of the things that we need to talk about is what are some of the factors which have contributed, especially at this time. Some of you have mentioned that, to the rise of sectarianism. There is no doubt with the emergence of the nation-state system after the First World War, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the collapse of the Persian Empire to a certain extent, because those states were pluralistic states. They were polyglot states in many ways that had many different ethnic and religious groups. But at the same time, there was the millet system that was based on the millet system. After the collapse of these states, we saw new identities emerge as with the rise of the Turkish nation state, the Arab nationalist states in Iraq and Syria. And to a certain extent, why is it that after these experiments, why are we seeing today the failure of those states? How much of it has to do with the failure of these states to deal with the social and economic problems that are confronting their own population? How much of it has to do with the external threats that are coming from the outside, the perception that the Arab states have failed to stand up to Israel, the Arab states have failed to stand up to Western domination and hegemony, whether it's military, economic hegemony, or cultural hegemony. And anybody who wants to take that, I think I would like to hear from some of you.
Well, I would say, it's interesting that you raised the question of Turkey. Of course, Turkey and the Arab states in the Levant were all a product were all, of course, the Ottoman Empire. And then, but Turkey emerges as a secular republic. But the secular republic in Turkey was predicated, on what happened to the Armenians, the Armenian genocide, and of course the campaigns before the genocide in the 1890s, and then of course with the Greek-Turkish population exchange, where 1 million Greeks were expelled from Turkey and 400,000 Muslims were expelled from Greece in this forced population exchange. And so the secularism of Turkey is predicated on the elimination of at least one major aspect of religious diversity in Turkey. Of course, there are issues of Alawis and Kurds that continue in Turkey. These problems didn't go away, but the secularism there is predicated on this, what we would today refer to as ethnic cleansing, but also a systematic state policy, but also finally a strong government, a very powerful government. In the Arab world, on the other hand, it's not the Arabs who created the Arab world, it's the British and the French. Sykes-Picot and the French and the British in Palestine and in Iraq. It's very interesting. On the one hand, the French create Syria, they divide Syria, but they create Syria. So they create Syria, they take Lebanon away as a Christian country, they divide Syria furthermore into Alawi and Druze and the state of Aleppo and state of Damascus, and then they, after the rebellion of 1925, they put it back together. And the French are doing what the British are doing in Iraq, which is creating a state, wanting it to be a functioning state, but not an anti-colonial state. And sort of it's an extraordinary paradox. Plus the what happened in Palestine, which we talked about in the first panel, and the catastrophe of 1948 and the Nakba and the consequences, put those all together. And you have an extraordinary situation, which is quite unlike the situation of Turkey.
I think what you mentioned about Turkey and secularism is very interesting, because also one of the things that we have to remember is the role of the military in Turkey, I think. But something very interesting came out the last couple of weeks. One of them is that what Kılıçdaroğlu, who is the leader of the largest opposition party in Turkey, said about Erdogan. He said that Erdogan, and this Kılıçdaroğlu is probably one of the most secular leaders in Turkish politics today. He said that Erdogan has to remove the Yazid that lives inside of him, which is quite interesting for a secular leader to go back to the Umayyad era and the killing, of course, the martyrdom of Imam Hussein. And use that example. But I think in a way he was also responding to what Erdogan said during the elections, because Erdogan was talking about trying to point out to the fact that Kılıçdaroğlu is a Alawite, or Alawi as the Turks call it, by saying that Kılıçdaroğlu, and he would say that in Sunni audiences during the election, that Kılıçdaroğlu was not following closely the teachings of Haji Bektash, who is one of the saints of the Alawis in Turkey. So even in somewhat more secular Turkey, we still see these kind of terminologies. And the point that I would like to ask you all also, since you, Ussama, you brought this up about what happened to the Armenians, but there were massacres of Assyrians, for example, in the 19th century, and of Armenians in the latter part of the 19th century, of Assyrians and Armenians again in the early part of the 20th century. And the issue that's emerging now, what's happening to the minorities. Many minorities, especially including there are some minorities that are facing extinction. One of them is the Sabi'a community in Iraq is facing extinction. They may not survive for 10 more years. The Shabak, the Ahl Haq are facing a great deal of, they also may be facing existential problems. The Christians, Iraq used to have 1.3 million Christians before 2003. If there are 500,000 today there, that may be high. We're seeing what's happening in Syria. We're seeing what's happening in Egypt is a perfect example. Maybe Dr. Haddad, you want to take that, and if anybody else wants to take
Sure.
it, please go ahead.
When I was in Beirut last summer, there were signs all over Beirut that says, "Who would protect the Christians?" So they're always looking for protection. And I was doing some research trying to find out, and all these massacres came because they were seeking protection. In each one of them, some missionary or some foreign country has gone in and given support to Christians, and then they pulled out. And probably, to me, the most interesting thing, because I hadn't followed Lebanon before, what happened during the War of the Mountains, in which the Israelis told the Christians, you come help us, we'll get the Druze out, and then they left them, and the Christians were massacred. And in each case, they sought protection from the outside. But this idea of protection comes from the concept that was invented by Europe, which is that there are minorities, which is where the sectarianism comes from. Before that, under the Ottoman Empire, there was no concept of minorities. There was concept of dhimma or something else, but not concept of minorities. So if you look at what Christians are fighting for right now, they're asking for citizenship. They don't want to be called less than a citizen. They're against dhimma, against the idea of aqalliyat, which is minority. Absolutely everything you read in Egypt, even in Syria and Iraq, the Christians are saying we don't want to be considered as minorities. But when you have elections, as they had in Egypt, and what the Muslim Brotherhood said, we won. So we have the power, and just like in the United States, when the Democrats win, they put Democrats, and so you lost. And in a sense, what has happened is once you identify the religious groups as minorities, and some of them are still seeking that. I mean, for example, the Pope in Egypt still wants, Copts appointed, a certain number of Copts to be appointed to the Congress. So they say we don't want to be treated as minorities, but they're insisting that they be treated as a special group. And that is contributing to this idea that Christians don't belong there. And increasingly, if you look at the material that the Salafis and the Muslim Brotherhood are publishing about Christians, and even some of the material that Al-Azhar has published, is that the Christians belong to the West, and therefore they are fifth column.
Just to follow up quickly on that, to what extent do you think the American interventions in the Middle East, particularly whether it's in Afghanistan or whether it's in Iraq, are influencing, although many Christians have nothing to do with the West, in fact, many of them oppose them. But to what extent do you think that has been a factor? They identify, for example, Christians with the West, with the United States.
Right.
Is there anything to that?
Absolutely. And the other thing that you have to keep in mind is that the Muslim Brotherhood was adopted by American policy during the Cold War. And Muslim Brotherhood people came to the United States because they were given asylum. And then it was some of these same people who were raised in the United States. I mean, I remember going to a panel in which the head of the Muslim community was looking at one of the Muslim Brotherhood and said, this one of us, he had come from Egypt. But these are people who have been raised in the United States. One of the things, I'm writing a book on Sayyid Qutb, and I found out that his book was translated by the by the CIA, published by the Franklin Institute, which was a CIA front. It was translated into every Islamic language and distributed throughout the Muslim world. And the most fascinating thing is—
Which book of his?
Social Justice in Islam. And the person who translated it into Farsi is Khamenei. Right? So if you look at the writings of Khomeini, you will see he quotes Sayyid Qutb. So that the idea of Islam being a political policy or a political ideology comes from Sayyid Qutb, who was in the US for a while, but also his ideas, take in some of the Christian political theologies, incorporate them into Islam. And for example, he's the first one who wrote about establishing the kingdom of God on earth. And this is a Christian concept. I've never seen it in any Islamic text before. But now we have a book by Gindi saying, establishing the kingdom, Mamlakatullah ala al-ard, So it has been absorbed as a Muslim concept. I think she wants.
Well, when the Americans went into Iraq, they were allies with the Shia and not with the Christians. Yeah, when the Americans went into Iraq, they were allied with the Shia and not with the Christians. I mean, I worked in Iraq on national reconciliation issues between 2006 and 2009. And I mean, the narrative I got when I was there is that the Christians were mainly targeted because they had good houses. You know, they were coming after them, the militia, to get their houses. They were coming after them to get their shops. In fact, in one area in Baghdad in 2009, there was a whole street where Christian businessmen had their shops. That was, you go there, it's totally abandoned. The Christian fled because what happened is that they went, killed one Christian merchant, and then everybody else fled. But they went in because they wanted that street. They wanted those shops. Granted, there are fears, and there are legit fears that Christians are feeling in the Middle East about being persecuted, about being kicked out. And if, you know, look at the demographics, look at the numbers. You have also a lot of immigration that's happening from the Christian community, if we take in Lebanon. But here, let me be controversial. Let me be a devil's advocate a little bit and basically talk about, for example, Christians in Syria. I think also, I don't get it, to be very honest, how a group that is feeling itself as a minority allies itself with a regime that is basically, you know, opposed by 70% of the population. I mean, that decision of going and standing with the Syrian regime, with the Assad regime, at a time when, you know, there is no future for this regime in the long term, that for me is political short-sightedness. It is political stupidity. And the same thing in Lebanon. I mean, instead of Christians basically, as they have always been, playing the role of how to say, the kingmaker, the pivot role between the different communities, they are in fact retrenching themselves into this minorities mindset and missing a major opportunity by their internal divisions of really coming and playing the role, for example, that the Kurds have been playing between Sunni and Shia and Iraq. I think there is an opportunity, if the Christians in Lebanon were to unite, to play that role between the Sunni and the Shia. And they are missing this by very much embracing this minority mindset and really embrace and moving away from the citizenship mindset. And that's where I agree with Dr. Haddad, is that the criteria should be citizenship mindset and not a minority mindset.
Yeah, I do want to make some comments. I have some difficulties accepting that this sectarian feeling is a normal thing, or sectarian organization or sectarian conflict is a normal thing when there is a stress in society. The danger in this, that it deviates attention from roles that are being played in fomenting this feeling and creating conflict. Now, with respect to the minorities, if religion, if sectarianism would become part of the political system, part of the constitution, everyone, Christian or non-Christian, who feels that I do not belong to this ideology would feel alien, would feel not belonging, would not be able to participate in life. Now, talking about the Syrian Christians, why did they side with the regime? Well, when you have seen your priest and your church and being destroyed, and when you see a fatwa from Daesh, it started with Nusra, with Jabhat Nusra, that allows the expropriation of any Christian property because the Christians are. So I think there will be good reason for the Christians to feel to feel the way they feel, to associate themselves the way they associate themselves. I'm not suggesting that in Lebanon the Christians were beacons of wisdom and enlightenment and all that stuff. I know all their weaknesses. First, they are divided among themselves, and they instead of playing a positive role between Sunnah and Shia, they divided themselves. Half went to Shia, half went to Sunnah, and they contributed to the chaos. But I don't think this is the brain who is, in my judgment, the real brain in this is if someone asks me, who is the chief architect of this sectarian conflict invading the Middle East, I would say it must be a media specialist. You know, those who can make someone feel that the other is the enemy. Notice now even some newspapers that would report simple things. I read, for example, Quds al-Arabi in the morning. There is hardly an event that is reported where you don't read. The Shia have attacked, the Alawis have attacked this village, which is majority Sunnah.
That's new.
And
That's new reporting. It's a new kind of reporting.
It is. You would, for someone who is not paying particular attention, you will, and he has a collective memory throughout history, all kinds of fears, apprehensions, and things. He would think, well, there is danger, and the only way to hide is to go to my community, thinking that this will be a hiding place. Lebanon is an example of countries where the sects thought that they will settle a political problem through a sectarian conflict, and we have seen a country that has come apart and didn't come together again, and it's still a failed state for all practical purposes. I think the issues of minorities is solved only when there is an inclination, when there is an awareness of a need to have the society come together and to do away with anything that divides societies by necessity, by law. For example, the concept of ummah among all Islamists, Muslim brothers and others, is completely different from concept of ummah by the Arabs, for example, the Arab nationalists. And notice one thing, when in 1958 there was a union between Syria and Egypt, the United Arab Republic, the constitution of the United Arab Republic didn't make reference to the religion of the state, didn't make reference to the religion of the head of the state, didn't mention that Sharia is the source of legislation. The Arabs were at a certain comfort and they were trying to get together. Whoever has an interest in tearing apart the society would have an interest in promoting sectarian feelings.
Okay, but can I just say on this point, just a very quick, in the spirit of devil's advocacy, what is it?
Devil's advocate.
Devil's advocacy, or whatever it is. Let me say just a couple of points. I mean, of course, you're absolutely right that you keep saying those who have an interest in dividing up, and that's absolutely true. There's no question about that. But then I think that sort of takes away from the fact that there are, of course, internal, and there's nothing to be ashamed of or to be embarrassed by, to acknowledge that the Arab world and the Middle East is diverse, and diversity constitutes a problem in the modern nation-state form. So, we keep talking about the Ottoman system. It's true in the Ottoman system there was diversity, but there weren't rights. Let's not romanticize the Ottoman system. The Middle East system was not a system of rights. It was a system of privileges on a very sectarian, of course, basis. And I'm curious, in 1958 in the United Arab Republic, or in Egypt before, or in Syria, the Ba'ath of Syria, were there personal status laws or not? Because then the issue of sectarianism is not just violence, it's also al-ahwal al-shakhsiyya, personal status laws. And so the question is, so it's not just Western interventions, it's also the fact that there are real issues that people have to grapple with that are not just Western impositions, without in any way, shape, or form apologizing or ignoring the fact that the West, Britain and France especially, and then the US, have played a catastrophic role in shaping the Middle East that we have today. There's no question.
I don't want to give the impression that sectarian culture doesn't exist in the Arab world. It is the idea of exploiting what exists in the most vicious way. I know, just for example, just before the Civil War, they used to gather
which one?
Students. The Civil War in Lebanon, yeah. Which one? You're right. So many.
No, I'm just trying to keep track.
And students and intellectuals, they wanted to scratch the sect from their identity card. This was their feeling at the time. And look at Lebanon now, after 30, 40 years from that war. Where are we now? And the belonging to a sect existed. And it is a part of the culture. It lived in the 19th century. It started probably from the agreement with the Medina agreement, gave some kind of arrangement with communities other than Muslim communities. But what we have now, we have a very dangerous phenomenon. It is a problem, even if it were a natural problem in civilized society, in rational societies. They adopt laws and institutions to overcome these problems. What we do, we try to make a problem much worse than it is.
I think you
Dr.
put.
Sorry. Go ahead.
I think you put your finger on the major problem here that is also has contributed to all of this is the failing state institution, or the very weak state institution that have not been able to negotiate and manage political conflicts. And that has contributed to the state of affairs. And this has been the case all along since independence in the Arab region. And so I very much second what Ussama said. It's the outsiders definitely played a role in this, but also let's not, keep our sights away from our own failings and as people, and also the failing of the different movements that have taken place in the Arab world, including the secular movement, and how it has failed, in my opinion, the secular cause and the democratization cause in the Arab region.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to the sort of questioning of where the Syrian Christians are. We did an interview with Patriarch Hazim before he died, and that question was raised. How could the Christians of Syria support Al-Assad regime? And what he said is, we consider ourselves to be Arab Christians, unlike Lebanese, who might think that they're Phoenicians, or the Copts, who might think they're sort of
this concept of Phoenician is very old, so
whatever.
Nobody
okay?
thinks this
But
way.
basically, the Orthodox Church, thinks of itself as the Arab Christians of the Middle East. And he said that we have survived all these various regimes and everybody because we are not taking sides. We have survived is that whenever there is a change in leadership, we support whoever comes to power. That was his response.
But I disagree with you. They are taking sides in Syria.
Now,
They are.
of
Yeah,
course,
they
because
are
the
taking
churches
sides.
have
And
been
they are-
bombed and wiped out.
Well, they are siding with the wrong party, in my opinion, in the long term.
Who should they side with?
I think they should side with where the majority of the Syrian people are. They should. Christians in the Middle East,
Who are the majority?
Christians in the Middle East have always played an enlightening role in the region. I
Right.
think it is their destiny
I'm not
to,
sure we can say that.
it is, I think, their role in Syria is to side with the democratization agenda. Whoever the people picks eventually, that's where the
But
role.
we're not picking right now. They're still duking it out with churches falling right and left.
Let's take one final comment on this
I
from
think the
David.
democratization by Jabhat al-Nusra or Daesh is the future that the Christian should support in Syria. Well, the only thing that the West fears now in Syria is elections, even if Assad wants to run again, supervised election internationally. They fear that he might win. This fellow who 70% of the Syrians want to get rid of him, they fear that he might win. When we start with premises, with some facts that have nothing to do with the reality, it's very difficult.
I just, unless Randa, you want to.
Well,
quickly?
well, what I want to say is that I agree with you. The increasing role of the Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIS, Daesh, is a worrying trend in the Syrian revolution. But also, we have to remember the people who started the Syrian revolution, people who were killed by the Syrian regime, the non-violent activists. And we are where we are in Syria, mainly because of the security approach that the Syrian regime has adopted from the get-go. And there were many opportunities where political solution could have been achieved, where a different approach by the Syrian regime could have prevented this catastrophe that we are seeing unfolding in front of our eyes. However, you know, we are where we are, and eventually I agree with you, there will be a political solution. The only way to settle this conflict is a political solution. And Assad might have a role to play in this political solution. But in the long term, Assad has to, and the core around him, like Daesh, like ISIS, have to pay a price for the crimes and atrocities they have committed.
Randa, can I ask you just the one last comment, a question to Randa, since you've raised this point. When you say the Christians should do X or Y, why do you frame it in those? When you frame it, when the question is framed in,
You have the,
Is it on?
no, you have, no,
it's on.
it's on? Okay.
Yeah, it's on. So when you say the Christians should take a position, the Christians take a position. I mean, isn't that precisely the issue that that is problematic? I mean, why are you sort of making an entire community or an entire group or entire people who presumably have different tendencies? Why do you say that they should take X or Y? And you talk about the Syria as if Syria is only 70% Sunni, and with a capital S, as if there's nothing else going on. I mean, so you sort of contradict your earlier point, which is that it began as a civil, democratic
Correct.
uprising
Correct.
against a dictatorship,
Correct.
just like in Iraq, where the dictator happened to be Sunni. Here he happens to be Alawi.
Correct. What my point was building on what Dr. Haddad has said in terms of minorities and the political decisions that minority make in a country like Syria or in a country like Lebanon. And I tend to look at them as definitely citizens. You know, I'm a member of a minority group when you put it in the whole prism of the Arab region. You know, I'm a Shia, and so as a Shia, I'm a member of a minority group in the region. However, my point is that in Syria, from the get-go, the Christian community, and especially the Christian religious leadership, has made many statements that were viewed by the people of the revolution as being in support of the regime. From the get-go,
Yeah,
from
so
the beginning.
You're conflating again Christian religious leadership
Right.
with the Christians.
I
of Syria.
agree with you,
so
but
there's
we
an
did not
issue
see
here.
many Christians except the likes of Michel Kilo and few other Christians rising up in the ranks of the opposition. I mean, for all practical purposes, the statements that are coming out of the Christian religious leadership in Syria
Which
is
ones?
viewed
Which ones?
the Christian Orthodox, mostly, which is the largest Christian group in Syria, the Greek Orthodox, is being viewed by the rest of the population, especially by the people of the
Syrian
revolution.
Orthodox or Greek Orthodox?
Greek Orthodox, are being viewed by the people in the revolution, are being viewed by a large group of the Sunnis as being anti-them, as being and that does not bode well for the long term, for the spirit of coexistence that has always existed in Syria.
If anybody wants just a 30 seconds response,
Just
because we want to open
my
the
30 seconds. I
questions
wish
to the floor.
we had time to dissect each and every word that my colleague has said, because I don't think that there is anything related to reality, either in the positions of the Christians or where the Syrian people want to go, what are the perceptions of who is at fault and who justified using weapons, and how the Syrian uprising been kidnapped and been guided by outside forces. All this would require a lot of time than we have for this panel and for this topic.
Okay, let's stop here. I had a couple of questions. One that had to do with what happened in Egypt, and to what extent, did we see both the Muslim Brotherhood and even their opponents fail? Why did they fail to reach some kind of accommodation? Is it because of their, and this I would like to have your answer maybe after we open the question to the floor. Maybe someone else will ask a question related to this. Is because to what extent did they really avoid inclusiveness? To what extent did they believe that democracy, majoritarian democracy, is what is equal to what democracy is all about? Not talking about the rights of others. To what extent is this polarization that we're seeing today is a result of very rigid ideological or political positions? How much of it has to do with political leaders trying to exploit certain political positions to their own advantage? So if anybody has any questions on this, otherwise if anybody wants to answer it later, that would be great.
No, please, let me see. Please. I'm Abid Musa, and I'm from Syracuse, New York. Just recently moved here to Washington area. And in 1958, I flew from Jerusalem to Beirut to go to college. And it was at the tail end of the civil war in Lebanon. They took us in a van from the airport through the 6th Fleet, which was in Ras Beirut, to campus. And the point which started with sectarianism, it started with the French when they put it in Lebanon. And I went for registration, and I gave her my name, my age, and everything, and she said, "Are you a Muslim or a Christian?" I said, "Well, I'm a Muslim." She said, "Are you a Shia or a Sunni?" I said, "I don't know." I was 18 years and 10 months old, and honestly, I didn't know. We never discussed that. This is a new phenomenon in our area. It was not there, okay? This is the statement which I want to say. When I went back at Christmas, when they gave us, went home, I asked my dad, God bless his soul, he said, "Yeah, we are Sunni, but we never discussed it." That was his answer. So this is the situation which was in Lebanon when the French came, and still it's going on, which I disagree with it, and I hope all the Lebanese will disagree.
And what's the question?
The question is, what started this lately? And this is started from somewhere.
Okay, this is a good question. We'll stop there, and we'll see if anybody wants to answer this. And then we have a question from the lady in the corner. And you want to go ahead and answer it in the meantime?
Yeah, what started this, the fomenting, promoting sectarian feeling, is done by interested parties, people who want it. Internally in Lebanon, you have, for example, the clergy have an interest in maintaining the system the way it is. And regionally, the way it worked out, Lebanon was dismantled. If we can dismantle Iraq, we did. If we can do the same thing in Syria, the best weapon, the most effective weapon, the cheapest weapon in tearing apart the social cohesion is this one, and we will use it. So there are interested parties who are using it, and all I hope for is some kind of awareness that we should avoid this trap.
Just one second. Did you have a question? And then we'll go to you.
We'll go right here in a minute. I just wanted to get in this question that comes to us from our online audience on Twitter. And the question is, why is everybody treating the, quote, Christians in Syria as one group? They are several communities. The problem in Syria is one of political culture, tolerance towards dissent, and different, more than one side, differences on more than one side than the other. Do you agree, and can you comment?
Anyone wants to take that?
I think that's a fair point. I think that's a fair point. But in politics, perceptions are what matter. And the perception today in Syria, in a large segment of the population that is pro-revolution, is that the majority of Christians, and I now reframe myself, the majority of Christians are standing with the regime and not with the revolution. That's the perception today with the pro-opposition crowd.
Okay. The lady in the corner.
Hello, my name is Natalie Jensen, and full disclosure, I'm a geographer. So, as you guys are discussing this idea of sectarianism, which I'm not going to dispute, but I do think you're missing this idea of geography.
Yes.
Because, and this is something I thought a lot about, when I was doing my own research in the West Bank, which is where my expertise is. I haven't spent a lot of time in Lebanon. I've been to Syria a couple times. But, for example, when I was doing interviews, people always made sure that, they wouldn't self-identify as, say, Palestinians. They say, Anandablusi or Janini or whatever it is, and a lot of the last names actually indicate from where you're from. So what I want to ask then is what role that idea of regional identity, and again, we're talking at different scales, right? The city itself, there's different sectors in the city, and then of course the regions, the mountains, what have you, the provincial capitals. What role does that play in maybe exacerbating sectarianism in the region?
Okay. Anybody wants to respond to that?
Yes, I mean, and I think I addressed this in when I said at the very beginning that this is a function of the nation-state form, which goes exactly to the question of geography and borders. And when you create states, and when you create particular forms of states, and you create borders, you create a problem of sectarianism in Lebanon, which is a function of the fact that there is a state called Lebanon, and you have to create a political system, and so on and so forth, and personal status laws. The same in Syria, the same in the West Bank, and the same in all these places. So clearly, there is no. You keep getting back to the question about the problem of sectarianism in the region. There's no singular problem. There's no one problem of sectarianism. But if you keep asking the question, demanding an answer, that there is no one answer. There is no one problem. And I think we have to keep that in mind, or else we get back into this endless sort of trap, discursive trap of keep demanding one answer, a brief answer for what is clearly a massive, complicated problem which involves history, geography, borders, nation-states, imperialism, as well as internal divisions. And I think the issue of keep saying internal or external, which goes back to Professor Khairallah's point, it's not internal or they work together. I think it's very hard to, after the 20th century, to talk about internal and external when the very states that have been created were not states that emerged organically in the region.
My name is Maysoon Shqir Ali, and I'm a physician. I want to ask the panelists, we all covered the sectarian issue very well. This cancer, what is the treatment for it? Who is the victim? The Palestinian cause, the Arab nationalism? Thank you.
Well, I'm going to make another controversial statement. Arab nationalism has been dead for a long time.
Yes.
And maybe that's one of the reasons why we have many of these isms that have risen to the surface after that. I think what we need to do is work on the nation-state project. That's what has failed us in the region, is we have not built state institutions, capable state institutions, that can manage political conflicts, that can bring citizens to the decision-making table. And as long as we have this kind of ill and problem, today is sectarianism, tomorrow it's going to be something else. People are going to be manipulated, but as well as they are going to revert to their own primordial identities because they feel not protected. They don't feel there is a state there that protects them.
To answer, or attempt to answer your question, the answer is yes to both. Both are victims. Nationalism and the Palestinian cause. And it is interrelated. Nationalism would strengthen the Arabic and Palestinian position and would put them in a different position. To make this society, make this cohesion difficult, impossible. Now, we can say that it is dead, because those who are still talking about Arab nationalism are really way off the point, and they're not effective. They don't have political parties. They are not organized, whatever. Arab nationalism lives in the memory of the people. They like to identify themselves as Arabs, remember old glories or whatever. But in reality, it is not effective. But the purpose of promoting sectarianism is to get to the Palestinian issue. Is because this is one of the most important things. Why, for example, would be an attack outside and inside, attack on Arab nationalism? Why would it bother any foreign countries that the Arabs are united and in a harmonious way and things like that? I can understand if they want the oil, they would want to control the sources of energy and whatever. But the main problem in the Middle East now is the Palestinian-Israeli problem. And to weaken the Palestinian side, promote any kind of division in society, anything that guarantees that they will never be united, and this is what we are seeing now.
Yes, we'll take some.
Thank you. It was interesting to learn that the United States supported the Muslim Brotherhood during the Cold War. And I wondered if the panelists could comment on any role Israel might have played years ago in promoting the growth of Hamas as a counterweight to Fatah.
You work on this stuff.
Well, I mean, what you stated is a fact. You know, they did support Hamas. Sorry? Okay. They did support Hamas against Fatah.
See what it is on.
Just hold it to your mouth. The microphone is missing.
There is no microphone.
Here, go ahead. Here, take this. Here.
Don't pull too hard.
I said what the question you raised is a fact, actually, because the beginning of Hamas, Israel supported Hamas as a means of countering, of dividing the Palestinians. And, when Hamas would be having demonstrations in Gaza, the Israeli army would look the other way, and if Fatah did, they would put them in jail. There is absolutely no question about it. It's a historical fact.
But also Hamas rose in reaction to corruption, to failure of Fatah. I mean, they express a mood of discontent that exists among the Palestinians, and we cannot discount that. I granted what you said, but also we have to say, focus on the internal. Hamas expresses a mood of discontent that has been in the making for a long time against the PLO.
George?
It's okay, I can speak louder. Thank you. Why is Israel insisting on being identified as a Jewish state? Do you have any suggestions? Even they want the Palestinians to identify it as a Jewish state as well. Is that sectarianism?
Well, yeah, I think it's obvious for Israel, who wants to get rid of the Arab population, of the Palestinians, would want some kind of justification to, and then in order to justify an existence which is an aberration in history, you don't have, I don't think any Jew would want to live in a Christian United States or a Catholic France or whatever. Here we have difficulty putting the Christmas tree, But in Israel, they would like to identify themselves as Jewish, to collect, to bring, to attract as many Jews as possible, and to get rid of as many Arabs as possible.
Yeah, but
I have a question that's
can I say something more?
Sure.
Yeah.
Quickly, yeah.
I mean, if you accept Israel as a Jewish state, then there is no place for Christians and Muslims. They're not only class citizens. There is no place for them. So you can get rid of them and have a Jewish state. And that is the ultimate surrender that they're asking for, that the Christians and the Muslims have absolutely no claim to be living in Israel.
And I think fundamentally the question you were asking about, is it a sectarian? Of course it's sectarian. It's absolutely because the whole point is that this is again a problem that's in the modern world from the 19th and 20th centuries, and is very much tied to what we've been talking about all along. It's very sectarian, just like the situation in Lebanon and Syria is also sectarian.
Randa, did you want to
No,
comment?
I mean you have
No.
there are
Okay.
problems. There are other problems. All right, we can talk about this.
Over here. Go
No, I was just going to follow on and just say, what is the role of Israel as a sectarian state in this? And I think you've already.
Yeah, but what's interesting, right, also is how Israel is not perceived as a sectarian state.
Exactly.
It's perceived as a secular state.
Exactly.
No, not just a democracy,
But
but,
only democracy in the Middle
as a
East.
secular. It's interesting. It's a
As
secular.
a secular.
As a secular question, which of course, at one level, it is just like the sectarian problems we see today are also not about religion, but about a secular struggle for resources and power. And the question is, people mobilize all sorts of whatever they can to achieve power. And I think we should just, again, understand this is not about religion. It's not about a medieval struggle about succession, but all about a contemporary struggle for power.
Yes, sir.
If Prophet Muhammad comes from that door now and he hears us talking about Shia and Sunni, the first question he will ask, will you please tell me what is Shia and what is Sunni? If the Prophet doesn't know what is Sunni and what is Shia, and he is the one who's the message of Almighty God revealed to him.
That's a very good point.
This is man-made. Man-made for personal gains, and it was perpetuated by the Zionists since the 18th and the 19th century. That's number one. Number two, Arab nationalism is not dead. Go around to Jordan, go around to Egypt and talk to people. Don't listen to their TV. And they will tell you the only solution is Arab unity. There is no other way. Arab unity, united Arab republics. This is the question. The answer, my friend, is democracy, democracy, democracy.
Yes, in the back. And then
Yeah, Mark Harrison with the United Methodist Church office. I was at a meeting 2 days ago, and it was suggested that the Kurds will have their own state in Iraq. Do you all agree with that? And does that mean that the Kurds in other countries would have their own state as well? Thank you.
I mean, I have to say that it's unfortunate that the state of Kurdistan is more of a reality than the state of Palestine today. You know, I mean, it's really unfortunate set of events, but that's what it is. I tend to see, because, you know, working on Iraq and Syria, I think at least the Iraqi Kurds, the KRG, I think it's only a matter of time before they separate from, you know, Iraq. And in fact, there are now increasing voices, even within circles close to the Prime Minister, that says that this current state of affairs of having one foot in the federation and another foot in an independent state is not sustainable in the long term, and that if they want to go, they can go. And I think, and if you look at young Kurds, and I've been talking to a lot of them, this whole idea of a united Iraq does not resonate. It's not part of their own concept of and part of their own identity group. And so in the future, I can see that happening. Whether Iraqi Syrian Kurds will join to form a larger Kurdish state. I mean, we have yesterday seen, or 2 days ago, the announcement of the establishment of a self-rule, kind of self-rule in the northeastern part of Syria, where there is a Kurdish majority. You know, time will tell how sustainable that is, and whether it will lead to a grand Kurdish state in the region.
One of the things about the Kurds is that in many ways, as Randa was mentioning, first of all, there is now this local government that has been established by the PYD, which is the strongest Kurdish political party in Syria. This party has historically been close to the PKK, the Kurdish Workers' Party in Turkey. In fact, many of the Kurds who live in that part of Syria are originally came from Turkey, and many of them either fled or were expelled during the Kurdish revolts of the 20s and the 30s. But one point that goes to what you were asking, there's no doubt that I think the 21st century in the Middle East is probably going to be the century of the Kurds. The Kurdish genie is out of the bottle, and it's not going to be easy to put the Kurds back in. And I'll stop there. Yes, sir, and then I'll come. Over here, just quickly, please, because we'll try to get as many of you as possible, so please make your
in regard to that question about calling Israel the Jewish state, well, one of the reasons is simple, because to be able to blame whoever criticizes Israel as anti-Semitic. And this is something that really needs to be clarified, and this is one of this, just a part of the sectarian issue, that we have to clarify this is nothing with anti-Semitism.
Yes, over here.
Hi, my name is Paul Costello. I'm with New Story Leadership. My question to each of the panels is there a problem in calling it sectarianism? I mean, 20 years ago, I worked in Northern Ireland, and there were panels like this in Northern Ireland. And after about a decade, they decided that the label caused more problems than it solved, because we're talking about the area in terms of religions and faiths and trying to squeeze all the complexities into that box. Is it time we started looking for some other ways of analyzing this, and that sectarianism as a label, it's to ask the wrong question because it's giving us the wrong answers?
Okay. I think that's a great question, and it's related to one question I wanted to ask at the end, but might as well ask it now, is what can be done to change the discourse, to reduce the violence, to move away from using violence and begin to talk to each other and begin to have dialogue? How do we manage this issue, these conflicts? If anybody has any thoughts, they want to go now, or if you want to go later.
Yeah, so I would say, of course, you could use other terms. You could say communalism. You could say there are any number of terms one can use. But I think the issue about how to resolve this, I mean, we don't resolve it as such, but to be at least mindful and aware, to not speak about Christians as one thing, or Jews as one thing, or Muslims, Sunni or Shia as one thing. I mean, but I think that's the tendency. We in shorthand, very quickly, we start saying the Christians did this, the Muslims did this, the Sunnis did this, the Shia did this. That's where, at least as scholars or as people who are educated, we do have a responsibility to always historicize, always historicize, always historicize. In other words, put things in context and try as best we can to avoid and to catch ourselves when we generalize. We all do it. It's part of the way we speak and talk and think, but that, I think, is the most important thing we can do, because I think as soon as we get into the generalizations, the issues come up.
I think the important thing is to focus on the problem. The choice of the word secularization or sectarianism or communalism or whatever is of little relevance. We talk about sectarianism to deal with a problem. The focus ought to be to what extent this kind of arrangement, this kind of sectarian system, wherever they have a sectarian system or inciting sectarian feelings, is harmful to the unity of society, to its future, to its economic progress, to its harmony, to live together. Is to that extent the focus is on sectarianism. And if we find out that the use of certain words, like Ussama said, labeling Christians, all Christians are this, and all Shia are this, and all Muslim are this, we are not capturing the reality the way it is, and we are not helping in any way solve the problem. The focus ought to be to what extent the nourishment, the promotion of this sectarian culture is harmful to the society, and from there we should start.
the issue of what we can do, I mean, if you look at Iraq, a major part of the problem, and especially of what's going on today, is the failure of the National Reconciliation Project in Iraq when it had a chance to. The same thing in Lebanon. I think after Ta'if, that National Reconciliation Project was aborted. To date, in the Arab region, and I'm generalizing here because I've looked through that, we don't have a single successful model of a national reconciliation, not one. And I think that's the way forward. And that's why I'm of the opinion that the state system is not going to implode or is going to disappear. I think it has proved to be more resilient. The Sykes-Picot state system has proven to be more resilient. It has been subjected to a number of stressors over the years, from the Lebanon war to the Iraq war, now in Syria. And I think it's going to continue to be there. I think what needs to happen, and that's the responsibility of the civil society, in my opinion, in each of these countries, and I agree with Ussama, country to country, we have to look at each of these countries differently, is to push for national reconciliation project, national reconciliation program. And that's where civil society really needs to play a major role, this bottom-up approach, which, in my opinion, political elites have no interest right now in pushing for it. I mean, the state of affairs is very much convenient to them.
You know, whether it's in Iraq or in Egypt, both sides have been very rigid in their positions. They see it as a win or lose, basically. Yvonne.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about the fact that whether we call it sectarian or not, the situation on the ground is what they see is a sectarian divide. And if you see that, you know, I attended a conference in May in which all the Christians, I mean literally Catholics and Orthodox and Protestants who probably would consider themselves heretics, right? Each other heretics. They met together to talk about the situation of the Christians because they felt threatened. Since then, there have been 4 conferences in Lebanon and in Amman in which all these leaders of the Christian churches are getting together and talking about the situation and thinking, you know, what is the future of Christians in the Middle East? Basically because almost half the Christians of the Middle East have opted out. The Pope wants them to stay there so that they can be a witness. Some of the Muslims want them to stay there because they can explain Islam better to the West, so they're the mediators. And they're all scared about their children, and they say, get out if you can. There is no future for Christians here. So whether we call it sectarian or not is really irrelevant, because the way they're experiencing it is that it is Christian victims of Muslims, whether they're Sunni or Shia. Now, if you look at the Muslims, they're also looking at it as sectarian. And whether it's fomented from the outside or the inside, whether it's political power or power grab of some sort, it's still being looked at as religion. And what was interesting is I've been doing a survey of what has happened in Lebanon since 1975. There is a great effort after 1990 for dialogue. Dialogue is going to cure everything. It's going to bring peace and understanding. And you look and you see there are professional dialoguers, people who appear on every meeting, and they fly all over the world, fancy, you know, first class, and they talk about how wonderful Islam is for Christians, and Christians talk about how wonderful it is, we love Muslims, and they go on. And it doesn't make any difference.
Well, we are sorry we have come to the end of our time. Please join me in thanking this excellent panel that gives us a lot of thought-provoking ideas.